Brad and I were thinking about that. We were thinking about what songs we would do this week, and what songs the band should be playing, and of course, we came up with that '70s song from Creedence Clearwater Revival, and we typically try to skew the idea that we're just a bunch of hippies from the '70s. We do try to avoid that by doing, Steph Florence and the Machine, and I mean just any number of current stuff. But that song really seems to speak to where things are, right? And that was speaking about the Vietnam War. That was speaking about civil rights issues. But have we moved that far? Are we just back last week we sang that song from the Propellerheads, History Repeating? I mean, are we not just seeing sort of like, here we are again, back at where we've always kind of found ourselves? So I want to kind of look at this idea of this phrase up here, and I'm going to ask, just leave that phrase up there. I'm going to read a text to you first, and then we'll come back to this. But before I do, I want to think about an aspect of what I think it means to be truly present to where we are right now in a way that's transformative, and that is humility. And all throughout this, as we look at this phrase, and as I speak about different things, and you look up here again, and you kind of take a reflection on what's actually being said here, which DeAndrea sort of alluded to. So I want you to think about what strikes you in that phrase, what you see in that phrase, how you interpret that phrase. But I think I also want you to practice a little bit of humility. And to kind of get us in the mood for humility, I thought of this joke that I once heard from a rabbi friend who said that a rabbi and his cantor, the ritual singer, were in the sanctuary at the temple, and they were preparing themselves for Shabbat, for Friday service. And in the midst of everything, just out of nowhere, the rabbi fell to her knees, and she started crying up to the ceiling, and she said, "Oh, God, oh Lord, I am nobody. I am nobody." And the cantor, seeing that, felt inspired and moved, and so he too fell to his knees on the floor, looked up to the ceiling, and screamed out, "Oh Lord, I too am nobody. I am nobody." At which point the custodian for the temple came in and saw them and heard that, and then dropped the broom, fell to the floor, and too started screaming out, "I am nobody. I too am nobody." And the cantor looked over at the rabbi and said, "Look who thinks he's nobody." Okay, well, there's something to that if you think about it. If you've ever watched Nextdoor app, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? How quickly we turn on one another. So this text comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 40-42. And I'm reading from the Message version. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard John's witness and followed Jesus. The first thing he did after finding where Jesus lived was to find his own brother Simon, and he began telling him, "We've found the Messiah," that is, the Christ. "We found the Messiah," and then he immediately led him to Jesus. Jesus took one look up and said, "You're John's son, Simon. From now on, your name is Cephas," or Peter, which means rock. Now, this next text comes from the book, the letter to the church at Ephesus. Paul may or may not have written it. We're not real sure, the Apostle Paul. But it was clearly written in the earlier part of the mid-1st century, about 20 years or so after Jesus' death. Ephesians 1:23, "We are filled with the fullness of the one who fills everything in every way." We are filled with the fullness of the one who fills everything in every way. I don't know if you're remembering this. I'll just remind you back to Baum's, David Baum, his statement, right? The inseparable quantum interconnectedness is the whole universe, the fundamental reality. Paul said, "We are filled with the one who fills everything everywhere." All right. Jesus spoke in Aramaic, right? We all know that Jesus spoke in Aramaic. My wife and I had a clergy friend whose father said, "Well, Jesus actually spoke in King James, and that's why I read the King James Bible." when we told him no, Jesus in fact spoke in Aramaic, he quickly responded, well, he's Jesus. He could have spoken King James if he wanted to. And I thought, well, you can't argue with that reasoning, right? The problem is, though, that I think we missed the point, number one, because Aramaic was written with no spacing. So the words were, it was written in a common sort of Greek, not in Aramaic. Aramaic actually does have spacing between the combined letters, but Greek does not. So the words come together. They just look like one run-on series of words. So knowing how to interpret something is totally up to context. It's totally up to what you understand about sociology, about the social context, about the text itself, about the continuity of the whole text in all the writings that you're looking at, and like, for example, all the writings that were assumed to be part of the Gospel of John. So you have to make sense out of context. But context is interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you think about context, how often does your interpretation change of what you're looking at based on where you are at that moment and what you're thinking or what you're feeling at that moment, or what's going on around you? Not to mention your own history and your own social upbringing and context. So to think about the Gospel of John, we have to think about the fact that it's actually written 3 to 4 generations after Jesus' death. This would be like thinking about your great-great-grandchildren's stories about you, if you had any impact at all, right? It would be the stories they tell about you. Now, we assume that Jesus actually did have quite a bit of impact on a community, or otherwise there wouldn't be a community that began to form. But still, we're talking about 4 generations after. This is the early part of the 2nd century, the early church. This is after 70 A.D., when the temple had fallen to the Roman Empire, after 30 A.D., or 33 A.D., when Jesus was crucified. In 70 A.D., Jerusalem fell to the Roman Empire. Jews were scattered in every direction. So even those early Christian followers who were just called followers of the way, they weren't called Christians at the time, they scattered in every direction. So we're talking about another 40 years or 50 years past that. So we've got the early Christian community, which has already begun to decide who's right and who's wrong. Because we're good at that. We do that all the time, right? Not just in terms of our faith, we do it in terms of everything, which ought to tell us something right off the bat. If we're doing that with everything, perhaps we ought to rethink how we're looking at our faith as well, when we decide it is, in fact, the eternal, absolute way of seeing the truth. Because we question everything else and we interpret everything else out of our own context. So they're struggling with how to see Jesus. They're already arguing with what does it mean to see Jesus as human or Jesus as divine. So you have the Marianites, and you have the monastics, and you have the followers of John, and then you have the Judaizers and the Christians who were actually following Peter. So you have multiple communities arguing, and that's when you get into the 3rd century, and it begins to culminate in towards the forming of these creeds, which establish who's right and who's wrong and who's a heretic and who's not. All of that is already in the early formation here in the Gospel of John. It was also a time of tension, right? It was also a time, that's what I want you to understand, was that this time that this church is in, that these writers are in, is a time of living on the edge. It is a time of tension not too unlike our own, where they have experienced violence, they have experienced war, they have experienced death, they have experienced alienation for one another, they have experienced this sense of ennui and of hoping for something better. And they've also experienced the power and the healing that comes from finding connection and comfort with like-minded people. So they understand this whole idea of living on the edge. I was reading an article. I get this blog that some of you all I know get, which is by Diana Butler Bass, the sociologist and the post-evangelical writer who's written a number of books. We've talked about her in here before. She writes in a blog that she calls The Cottage. She describes our predicament today as this similar kind of reality of living on the edge. 18 months of pandemic, hospitals overflowing, children are now getting sick, anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers driving our health policies in some states more than in others. The climate report, code red for humanity, with horrible data that was affirmed by the first recorded rain in Greenland, on the Greenland ice cap, the first rain ever recorded. The Taliban are now marching across Afghanistan with women and children fleeing, fearful for the fundamentalist advance, fearful for their lives. Earthquakes in Haiti, hurricanes, and flooding. We are on the edge, she says, and the view from here is terrifying. Edges are frightening. When we find ourselves on these edges, what do? We turn for any sense of familiarity. We turn to any sense of camaraderie. We turn to any sense of kind of lining up, allying ourselves with others. It was interesting when, again, on Nextdoor app, maybe you see this because you're on Nextdoor app too, I've been watching tweets and the Nextdoor conversations and conversations on Facebook, and it's always interesting as someone who tries to watch from outside of the conflict, which is not easy. But sure enough, someone had the audacity, maybe the curiosity, but I consider it a little bit audacity as well, to say, so this is not an official test, not an official survey, but just tell me who here thinks we ought to mask or not mask. Right? Well, it's pretty predictable what's going to happen next. And then, of course, he said in parentheses, please don't get into a debate. And everyone else was doing the same thing. It was like, oh, that's going to happen. And sure enough, it was going great. No, yes, mandate, choice, mandate, choice, mandate. Well, they need to be mandated, damn it. And then it went into this argument. And then the next person came in, well, if you read this, children are getting carbon dioxide from breathing inside the... It was just one thing after another until the guy came back on. Again, I'm just curious about your position. Then again, it just jumped right back into it. And it went on for hours. I stopped kind of reading it and going back and forth to it. But my point being is when you see these kinds of conversations, when you enter into them with others, I have to ask myself, what does this mean? How do I see this word, this phrase? Earlier this week, I went to one of my favorite breweries, and I was talking to the guy behind the bar, the brewmaster. I don't know what his technical term is, but the growler keeper, I suppose. And as I was talking to him, he engaged me in a conversation. Now, he knows I'm a minister, and he knows I'm a Methodist minister. Even though he knows I'm progressive, he still loves to engage me as one of the Christians. He still loves to sort of tease and see where he can ruffle my feathers. And so he looks at me and he says, so why is it that you Christians, and he kind of points to me, and he says, why is it that you Christians can't see the truth about science? There's no God out there taking care of some and letting others die. I mean, what kind of God is that? But here's some nut job on the other side of the country preaching in front of a whole congregation and the thousands watching that we ought not to be wearing masks. In fact, he's going to throw you out if you put on a mask. He said, where is God when all of that's happening? And everyone's thinking this whole virus is a conspiracy. And now what about Afghanistan, he argues, where now the Christian United States has taken their God and left the country so that everyone else has to die by the hands of those other crazy religious nut jobs. And I thought to myself that when I'm listening to him, I have to let him kind of run his air out. I have to let him kind of exhaust his anger and his frustration. But the reality is that he's not angry. And the reality is that he's not frustrated. Not with that. But he is experiencing something disassociated. He is experiencing some kind of alienation. I've reminded myself about the African-American poet who wrote in his book, The Book of Delights, often people will say to me, how can you think about joy at a time like this? Because his Book of Delights is all about finding joy in every kind of moment, in small moments, even in the context of the racial oppression and bias and prejudice that he's experienced personally. Where do you find joy in all of that? But he says to that, he says, how can you not find joy, especially in times like these? So my question this morning as we think about this text, just what is it the disciples are inviting the others to come and see? Just what is it that we are invited to come and see? That when we say to church folks or non-church folks out there, because right now we've got this series going on for the whole church, which is called No One Walks Alone at First United Methodist Church. And by the way, there are signs up here. We'll have them in the back. I want you to put them in your yard. I only have 7 of them, so only 7 of you get signs. But I want you to put it in your yard, and it actually, I put on there, I want to be sure 1111 is on that list of services, because you see, we need the church as much as the traditional church needs us. Because we're a part of that way of seeing in the world that is wider than ourselves. We're a part of redefining and reframing and re-understanding who we are in terms of just who is this Jesus and what is it we're trying to see. What are we inviting others to come and see then? I've always had this biggest challenge of seeing anything new, of seeing something that's more helpful to the moment of what Jesus might be inviting us to do. In every conversation, in every encounter that I'm in, even with the guy at the brewery, as much as it's tempting to repel, to go hide, to kind of move back, to change the subject, I'm always seeing these moments to think, what does that mean? What does that phrase mean? How do I see that phrase? When I'm feeling alienated, when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the situation, what is that phrase saying to me? How do I see it? That's the challenge, I think, the paradox, the conundrum that we always find ourselves in. And we're all human. We naturally gravitate to where it's comfortable. We naturally move to where it's familiar. That's our default position. The other day, a woman came up to me. I was at a workshop, and she came up to my wife and I. We were both sitting there serving food and at this workshop, and she came up, and we were talking about these different ways in which we relate to one another. It was about personality types and stuff. And then she looked at me and she said this phrase. I guess she knew we were ministers, and she said, well, the important thing for my son, as he's growing up, as long as he's keeping his eyes, as long as he's keeping his eyes, I think he'll be okay. And I swear I wanted to look up and go, on the tiles? The design? What are we talking about? What does that mean? And of course, I'm being facetious, right? But the reality is, does she know what she's talking about? When we recite what's familiar, what's become comfortable, what we think we're seeing, do we really know what we're talking about? Or are we simply operating out of a place of comfort? I was listening to the On Being podcast, and I heard the author of White Fragility, trying to think of what her name is, and I wrote it down just so I wouldn't forget it, and then I didn't put it down here. Or I did, but now I can't find it. Okay, the book White Fragility. Well, in White Fragility, the author, one of the things that she says is the hardest thing for her to recognize was that no matter how she looks at the issue of racism, of Black Lives Matter, of trying to be an ally with someone, LGBTQ people, no matter how I look at it, she said, I cannot help but see it as a person of white privilege. I cannot help but see it as a person who is white. I can't see past my own bias, no matter how much I want to try to. There is a way to begin that process, but it doesn't happen by me simply saying I'm an ally. It was interesting when the guy that she was talking with, when the other interviewee was saying the challenge of Black Lives Matter is that being an ally isn't the answer. The answer is transformation. And how do we experience transformation? That's, I think, the challenge of what this is saying here in this text. How do we experience transformation in our lives? There's an author, Dr. John Kaag, who's the chair of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts. I don't know how many of you know William James, know the name William James. I know some of y'all do. Some of you who studied philosophy and psychology. William James is considered the father of pragmatic philosophy or pragmatic psychology, empirical pragmatism, which is around the late 19th century, early 20th century. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Some of you might remember that because if you did freshman psychology, you probably had to read part of it at some point. The thing that's fascinating about William James is this book that Dr. Kaag wrote. It was called Sick Souls, Healthy Minds, How William James Can Save Your Life. And I thought I had to listen to that. And so I listened to it because William James is an interesting character. Somebody who was the father of psychology, spent a decade worth of his 20s and 30s terrified, feeling completely isolated, overwhelmed and depressed, and often very suicidal. The father of empirical psychology, the father of pragmatism, often felt suicidal. And so when Dr. Cogg tells his story about William James, he said, what do you do when you look at life, and like Albert Camus, the French philosopher, you think to yourself, life is completely, absolutely indifferent to me. The final analysis, logic takes it all the way down the line. I'm just here for what purpose? Life really doesn't know, it just moves on. And William James was faced with this same sense of alienation. How do I find a sense of purpose in what we're doing? Now, he studied the various religious traditions which all spoke to this need, right? This very issue of our human condition, our mortality, our anxiety, our basic existential realities, it speaks to that. Like the woman's pointing to the whatever and saying, as long as he keeps his mind on that. It speaks to that, and yet it doesn't speak to that, because what we are to see somewhere along the line has to change us. It has to transform us. And how does that happen? So the author, he said, when William James finally came to his senses about what he had to do was why he's called the father of pragmatism. Because he literally saved his own soul. He came to terms with something called the sick soul, which is that sense of alienation, that sense of being separate, that sense of being overwhelmed by anxiety, that sense of panic and panic attacks where you feel like the whole world is against you and you are completely isolated in the midst of everything else. That sick soul, he said, the only way he could heal that was by connecting with the moment he was in. He literally chose to think otherwise because he believed we were a part of something larger. Now, he termed that a mystical experience. He termed that otherness God. He termed that otherness sacredness. After studying all the world religions, he said there's lots of different expressions of this reality, but how do you participate in it? You have to be present and choose to be present in the moment. You know that old story, that old folk tale about the grandfather who's with his grandson, and the grandfather says to his grandson, he says, son, in your mind, in your soul, there are two wolves. There is the good wolf who looks out to look at life from a positive, healthy, engaged way. There is the bad wolf, which is completely self-absorbed and alienated and angry and petty, and they are constantly struggling with each other within you. And the boy looks back at his grandfather and he says, grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather looked at the boy and said, whichever one you feed. You remember that story? The one you feed. William James understood that essentially within his own soul, within his own being. He understood that, and he said the way, in fact, I don't know if I got the quote here correct. He said, we tend to see ourselves, we have this innate tendency to see everything around us from our perspective, as though we're the center of that universe at that moment. We're the center. We're afraid of this moment because it threatens us. We're anxious at this moment because it doesn't relate to who we are, or it's alienated from who we are. We tend to see the world from our own perspective. Climate change, all of these things affect us as if we were at the center. But what he says is that when we begin to realize that we are in fact a part of the whole, it transforms how we see everything. He said at some point, there is a state of mind among practices where you can become nothing, as if nothing, in the water spouts of God. What if the disciples, when they were running to the other friends and were saying, come to see Jesus, the Christ, the Holy One, the incarnation of divinity, of sacredness in our world, what if what they were saying was, come and realize you're nobody in the spouts of God? Come and see if you can't participate in the wonders of the moment. See how you can cultivate the wonders of the moment. Spouts of God is a rather archaic and grandiose way of speaking, almost a magical, mystical kind of way of speaking. What might the spouts of God be? How many times have you gone for a walk in the forest and you've looked down at the trail, and for the first time you've noticed the moss there, and the moss has suddenly overwhelmed you with this curiosity and this sense of wonder? Or how many times have you walked out in your backyard and you heard a bird sing, and you've heard birds sing most of your life, but now you heard the bird sing? Or how many times have you been present to a moment that literally caught your attention and changed that moment? William James said it's as simple as seeing that we are always present as if nothing in the midst of God's wonder. So it requires some humility, right? It requires setting our egos aside. It requires participating, making the choice, the intentionality. William James said it's easy for people who are suicidal to suddenly think there's absolutely no purpose for living. He tells them when they ask him, when people are really depressed, and they say, "What do you think?" William James would say to them, "Maybe." He wouldn't say yes. He wouldn't say no, life's not worth living. Yes, life is worth living. He would say maybe, because you have the choice to feed what you bring to life. You are empowered to do that. And then he would show them, he would teach them how they could find substance and meaning in the smallest things. And whenever they felt that sense of alienation, that's all you had to do. So my question to you as we kind of wrap up things here, and I'm going to invite the band to come on up. The band's up, all right. My question to you then is, or my suggestion to you is, how do you do that? How do you transform God is nowhere to God is now here in every single moment where you find yourselves? In every single conversation that you see online, in every encounter at the pub or at the grocery store when some are masked and others are not masked, and you're feeling a bit bullied and a bit defensive, how do you move to this place of God is now here, come and see? And I want to suggest there's two very simple things you can do. The first is when I was on the cliffs, rappelling off the cliff, and I was learning in college how to rock climb and how to rappel down. And at one point as I was coming down, I lost my balance. I leaned out, right? Because what do you do when you feel like you're at the edge, or you feel like you're about to lose your balance, or you feel overwhelmed? What do? You react against falling, but you tend to fall in doing so. And the guy up above shouted to me as I was kind of losing my balance and falling backwards, and he said, "Lean in. Move into it." What do we do when we find ourselves with someone who seems confrontive or difficult or distant or disconnected? We move in. Not defensively. We start asking questions to see what else is there, to see where the spouts of God are in the midst of this difficulty. We move in. And the second thing that I would invite you to do is that I would invite you to always think in terms of leaving the space you came into better than you found it. That being a part of the kingdom of God is transforming the space by bringing what we can to the moment and leaving it better than we found it. Not changed the way we want it, but changed in the sense that something new is happening. So that when my brewery friend argued with me, I looked at him and I said, "You know, you're right. I don't think that God is anywhere. I think that God is not anywhere nearby, not anywhere. But I do think God is now here." I said, "I think God is right here in our conversations." And he was kind of getting this dazed, confused look on him. I said, "Like right now in this moment as we're talking, I think God is here. You know what I think God is saying?" And he says, "What?" I said, "I think God is asking me to ask you what you think are the best Belgian brews." "That's what you do here, right?" And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what brews do you like?" And he started talking about that, and before we know it, we were talking about Belgian brews. We were talking about his wife's job at the school. We were talking about the challenges he's had in his life, and we had changed. I didn't change his mind. I don't ever think he'll come to church. I changed the moment because I was invited into it. You see? Not because I was going to change the world, it's because we were always invited into transforming. That's what it means to come and see something else here. God is now here. Amen.